Red Dead Redemption 3 is not announced so far, but eventually it will. So let's discuss some ideas regarding it, and I'll throw my ratings for them. First, can Red Dead Redemption 3 be about Jack Marston's sequel? The idea of Red Dead Redemption 3 following John Marston's son, Jack, has been floating around the community for a while, and it's a concept that comes with both exciting possibilities and some serious challenges. Picture this. It's 1914. Jack has just gotten his revenge on Ross, and the Wild West we know and love is pretty much dead. The railroads have won, cities are growing, and automobiles are starting to replace horses on the streets. On one hand, this setting could give us something really unique. The First World War is about to reshape the entire world, and America is changing faster than ever. We could see Jack struggling to find his place in this new era, maybe getting caught up in early organized crime or even heading to Europe as a soldier. There's definitely something poetic about the son of an outlaw facing a very different kind of violence in the trenches of World War I. But here's where things get tricky. Red Dead's identity is deeply rooted in the Western genre. The wide-open frontier, horseback rides through untamed wilderness, and the classic gunslinger aesthetic. Moving into the 1910s and 20s would fundamentally change what a Red Dead game feels like. Would it still be Red Dead if you're driving a Model T instead of riding a horse? Or fighting in urban sprawl instead of dusty frontier towns? The time period would also force Jack to deal with some heavy historical events. If the game runs through the late 1910s, you're looking at not just World War, but also the Spanish flu pandemic, and eventually the start of the Great Depression. While these could make for compelling storytelling, they might push the game too far from its Western roots and turn it into something closer to a Peaky Blinders-style crime drama or a war game. That said, Rockstar has already shown they can handle the death of the Old West masterfully. Both Red Dead games are essentially about the end of an era, so maybe following Jack as he navigates the final death throes of the frontier lifestyle could work. The key would be finding the right balance, keeping enough Western elements while acknowledging the changing times. Perhaps the most interesting approach would be to set the game in the border regions, where the Old West held out a bit longer. You could have Jack straddling two worlds, the modernizing cities, and the last remaining pockets of frontier life. This would let players experience both the familiar Western gameplay and new mechanics reflecting the changing times, without completely abandoning what makes Red Dead special. I'll give this idea 6 out of 10. It simply isn't the core RDR identity. Or we can move back in time and focus on Dutch van der Linde. Starting in the 1870s or early 1880s would place us right in the heart of what many consider the real Wild West era. You'd have all the classic elements: the rise of railroad empires, the aftermath of the Civil War, Native American conflicts, and plenty of lawless territories to explore. This setting wouldn't just feel authentic to the series, it would actually let us experience the golden age that Dutch kept reminiscing about in RDR2. One of the most fascinating aspects would be watching Dutch transform from an idealistic young man into the charismatic leader we know. We could see him develop his philosophy about freedom and civilization, maybe even understand what made him so passionate about fighting the system. Imagine playing through the moments where he first meets Hosea, their early scams together, and how they eventually decided to start taking in strays like young Arthur Morgan. The real goldmine here would be experiencing the formation of the van der Linde gang's family dynamic. Watching Dutch and Hosea become almost like fathers to Arthur, meeting a young John Marston when they save him from hanging, and seeing how characters like Susan Grimshaw and Bessie Matthews became part of this growing family. It's all the backstory that RDR2 teased us with through campfire conversations. We could also explore some of the legendary heists and adventures that were only mentioned in previous games. The Blackwater job wouldn't be hanging over everyone's head yet. Instead, we'd see the gang in their prime, when their Robin Hood approach to outlaws actually worked. Plus, this era would be perfect for showing why Dutch earned such deep loyalty from his followers. The gameplay possibilities are super rich too. As a younger Dutch, you'd likely be more agile and adventurous than Arthur or John. The focus could be on pulling off elaborate cons, building up the gang's reputation, and learning the leadership skills that would later define the van der Linde gang. Each major heist or con could show Dutch developing his signature style of mixing philosophy with outlawry. What makes this concept especially strong is how it would add depth to both RDR2 and RDR1. Seeing the origins of Dutch's ideals would make his eventual descent into madness even more tragic. Every character we meet would carry extra weight because we know their ultimate fates, but we'd get to see them in their optimistic prime. The one potential drawback might be that we know Dutch survives until 1911, which could reduce some tension. However, RDR2 proved that knowing a character's fate doesn't make their story any less compelling. It's all about the journey. I'll give it 9 out of 10 though. This concept scores so high because it hits all the right notes. It's set in the perfect time period for a Western. It fills in fascinating gaps in the series' lore. It has strong potential for both story and gameplay, and it maintains the core themes of the series while exploring them from a fresh angle. The only point it loses is for potentially lacking the redemption arc that gives the series its name, though they could certainly work one in through Dutch's early life experiences. The story of how Dutch went from an idealistic revolutionary to creating one of the most notorious gangs in the West feels like it's been waiting to be told since we first met him in RDR1. It would be a perfect way to round out the trilogy while actually taking us back to the height of the Wild West era that Dutch was always talking about. Next idea. What if story moves down the east from west? The big shift here would be trading those wide-open western plains for a completely different landscape. Dense forests of Appalachia, bustling eastern cities, and maybe even stretching up into New England. The game could focus on a different breed of outlaws, like the bootleggers running moonshine through mountain passes, early Italian mafia families, or Irish gangs in places like Boston or New York. The time period would probably work best in the 1880s to 1890s, when the East was already pretty developed, but still had plenty of lawless pockets. You'd have this interesting contrast where some areas are hitting peak industrialization, with factories and tenements, while just outside the cities you've still got rural communities living like it's 50 years earlier. This could create some really dynamic gameplay environments. Imagine riding through misty Appalachian trails one day, then navigating crowded city streets the next. Instead of desert canyons and prairies, you'd be dealing with dense forests, river valleys, and coastal areas. The environments would feel more claustrophobic and intimate compared to the wide-open West, which could make for some intense encounters. The story possibilities are pretty rich too. Eastern gang conflicts were often tied up in immigrant communities, labor disputes, and political corruption. You could have a tale about someone caught between their traditional community values and the ruthless new world of organized crime. There's also the interesting dynamic of how Eastern gangs had to be more subtle than Western outlaws. Less shooting from horseback, more protection rackets and political manipulation. But this concept faces some serious challenges. The Red Dead series is deeply rooted in Western imagery and themes. That's kind of its whole thing. Moving east would mean losing iconic elements like Mexican standoffs, cattle drives, and frontier towns. You'd also lose that sense of the last frontier that made the previous games so poignant. The gameplay would need significant changes too. Dense urban environments would mean less emphasis on hunting and exploration, more focus on social stealth and urban navigation. While this could be interesting, it might end up feeling more like a 19th century GTA than a Red Dead game. Score: I'll give it 6 out of 10. This idea loses points mainly because it strays pretty far from what makes Red Dead feel like Red Dead. While the concept is interesting, it might be better suited for a new IP rather than trying to force the Red Dead formula into an Eastern setting. The score isn't lower because there are genuinely cool possibilities here. The mountain regions could provide some of that untamed wilderness feel, and the clash between rural and urban America could create interesting drama. The vibe would be totally different though. Instead of that sun-baked Sergio Leone Western atmosphere, you'd have something closer to Gangs of New York or Peaky Blinders. While that's not necessarily bad, it might disappoint fans who come to Red Dead specifically for that Western experience. This could work if Rockstar really wanted to shake things up, but it would be a risky move that might alienate the core fanbase. The Eastern Gang era is fascinating and deserves its own game, but maybe it needs its own identity rather than trying to fit into the Red Dead series. The one way this could work better is if it was part of a larger story that connected back to the West, maybe showing how Eastern corruption and development ultimately led to the death of the frontier. But even then, it would be a tough sell for players who love the series specifically for its Western setting. Now what if Rockstar Games go all in for a Civil War story? Picture this. It's the 1860s, and America is literally tearing itself apart. You've got this perfect storm of chaos where the line between outlaw and soldier is blurrier than ever. Imagine playing as someone who starts as maybe a Union or Confederate deserter, using the war's chaos to build their own legend. You could be working both sides, playing armies against each other, all while building your own criminal empire in the shadows of this massive conflict. The setting would be absolutely insane for gameplay. You'd have these massive armies moving around, changing territories, and creating opportunities for everything from train heists to battlefield scavenging. One day you might be robbing a Confederate payroll wagon. The next you're conning Union officers, and maybe you're even playing both sides in some elaborate scheme. The moral complexity here could be off the charts, way beyond the usual honor system stuff. Think about the gangs during this period too. You had straight-up outlaws like Quantrill's Raiders, who basically used the war as an excuse to go wild. Your character could start bumping into historical figures like Jesse James when he was just getting started. Plus, you've got all these displaced people, freed slaves, Native Americans caught in the middle. There's potential for some really deep storytelling here. The map could be incredible too. Instead of just the frontier, you'd have this dynamic environment where battle lines are constantly shifting. Imagine riding through a plantation one day, then coming back a week later to find it burned to the ground and occupied by a different army. Cities changing hands, bridges being blown up, temporary camps popping up everywhere. The world would feel alive in a whole new way. What makes this concept extra juicy is that the Civil War was basically the event that birthed the Wild West as we know it. After the war, you had all these veterans who knew how to fight, had access to military weapons, and often had nothing left to lose. It's like witnessing the origin story of the whole Western genre. 8 out of 10 easily. This scores high because it's got everything a Red Dead game needs: moral complexity, historical weight, and tons of gameplay potential, while still keeping that outlaw spirit. It loses a 1.5 points mainly because the war setting might restrict some of the free-roaming feel that makes Red Dead special, and because balancing historical accuracy with fun gameplay could be tricky. The best part about this idea is how naturally it fits into the Red Dead series themes about the end of eras and the price of violence. You're literally playing through the death of the Old South and the birth of the Wild West. Plus all that gray morality stuff that Red Dead does so well. The Civil War setting cranks that up to 11. You could even tie it into the larger Red Dead universe. Maybe your character's actions during the war set up some of the situations we see in later games. Like, imagine if your choices somehow influenced why Dutch became so anti-government later on. Or if you crossed paths with some of the older characters' parents or grandparents. The only real challenge would be balancing the big historical events with the personal story Red Dead is known for. But if anyone could pull that off, it'd be Rockstar. They just need to find that sweet spot between Clint Eastwood movie and History Channel documentary. Now what if instead of an outlaw, you take charge of authority? So imagine you're playing as some frontier lawman in like the 1870s or 1880s. But here's the cool part. You're not just some straight-arrow cop. Maybe you're one of those morally gray US Marshals who's barely any different from the outlaws they're chasing. Think about it. These guys basically had unlimited authority in their territories, and some of them were just as brutal as the criminals they hunted. The gameplay could actually be super fresh, while keeping all the stuff we love about Red Dead. Instead of running from the law, you're building cases against gangs, tracking outlaws across states, and maybe even putting together your own posse of questionable deputies. You could still have all those sweet shootouts and chases, but now you've got a badge to back up your actions, even when you're doing some shady stuff. What's really interesting is how this could mess with the usual Red Dead formula in a good way. Like, maybe you start as this idealistic lawman trying to bring civilization to the frontier, but slowly realize you're becoming the very thing you're fighting against. There could be this whole thing about how having too much power in the Wild West corrupts you just as much as being an outlaw does. The mission structure would be pretty different too. Instead of planning heists, you're investigating them. You could be questioning witnesses in saloons, following leads across the territory, and piecing together clues about gang hideouts. Think of it like LA Noire meets Red Dead, but without getting too detective gamey about it. The real spicy stuff could come from dealing with the politics of law enforcement back then. Maybe you're getting pressure from wealthy ranchers to look the other way on certain crimes, or railroad companies are trying to buy your loyalty. You could even run into corrupt fellow lawmen who are worse than the outlaws. 7 out of 10. This score's pretty solid because it's a fresh take that could still feel like Red Dead. It loses some points because being a lawman might limit some of that outlaw freedom players love, and there's a risk it could feel too structured or restrictive. The best part of this idea is how it could show the other side of all those stories we've played through before. Like, maybe you cross paths with some younger versions of gangs we know, or even end up being one of those lawmen that Dutch and the gang were always running from. It could add this whole new layer to the series' story. Plus, there's something kind of perfect about ending the trilogy by playing as the force that ultimately ended the Wild West. The first 2 games showed us outlaws dealing with the death of their way of life. This could show us the people who helped kill it, for better or worse. The main challenge would be keeping that Red Dead feel while playing as a lawman. But honestly, frontier law enforcement was so loose and crazy that you could probably get away with most of the same wild stuff, just with a different excuse for doing it. And let's be real. Some of those old US Marshals were basically just outlaws with badges anyway. Of course, knowing Rockstar, they'd probably have some wild twist where your character ends up becoming an outlaw anyway, or realizes they've been the bad guy all along. But that's kind of what makes Red Dead great. Nothing's ever really black and white out on the frontier. Now can we vision multiple protagonists in Red Dead Redemption? Having multiple characters to play as could be really interesting for showing different sides of the Wild West. Like, imagine switching between an aging gunslinger trying to go straight, a young outlaw just getting started, and maybe someone caught in the middle, like a bounty hunter or a rancher forced into violence. Each character could have their own take on what honor and redemption mean to them. The cool thing about multiple protagonists is how it could play with the honor system in new ways. Maybe what's honorable for one character is completely different for another. A lawman's version of honor might be about upholding justice at any cost, while an outlaw's honor could be about loyalty to their gang. Your actions as one character could end up affecting the others in ways you didn't expect. This could really amp up the storytelling too. Imagine doing something as one character that comes back to bite another character in the ass later. Like maybe your honorable decisions as one protagonist accidentally screw things up for your other character. It could add this whole new layer of consequences to everything you do. But the whole redemption part of Red Dead Redemption has always been about this deep, personal journey. Having multiple characters might make it harder to get as emotionally invested as we did with Arthur or John. It's like trying to watch 3 different TV shows at once. They might all be good, but you might not get as deep into any of them. The gameplay could be fresh though. Each character could have their own skills and style. Maybe one's better at stealth and hunting, another's your classic gunslinger, and the third is more about smooth talking and cons. You could switch between them to tackle missions in different ways, kind of like GTA 5, but with more dramatic weight to it. 7 out of 10, I guess. This score is pretty solid because it's got tons of potential for new storytelling angles and gameplay variety. It loses points mainly because it might dilute that intense personal story that makes Red Dead special. Plus, there's always the risk that players might just stick to their favorite character and ignore the others. The best part about this idea is how it could show different perspectives on the death of the Wild West. Like, you could have one character embracing the changes, another fighting against them, and a third just trying to survive in the middle. It could make the whole theme of a dying era hit even harder. What would be really wild is if your choices with each character started affecting the others in ways you didn't expect. Maybe being honorable with one protagonist accidentally makes life harder for another. Or imagine if 2 of your characters ended up on opposite sides of a conflict without knowing it at first. Rockstar's already proved they can handle multiple protagonists with GTA 5, but Red Dead is a different beast. The series is all about these deep, emotional character arcs, and splitting that across multiple characters is risky. But if they could pull it off, maybe by making each character's story feel personal while still connecting to this bigger picture, it could be something really special. The honor system would need some serious tweaking though. Maybe instead of one universal honor bar, each character has their own version of what honor means to them. Could be interesting to play with how being honorable means different things to different people in the Wild West. And we are done. Let me know in the comments if you think any of the idea from these is usable according to you. Also, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.